Hello everyone and welcome to our Axial Age in China review. Going ahead and getting started here with question number one. Deep impacts. What is the Axial Age and how are the religious ideas and philosophies of the Axial Age different from the other religions we have discussed this semester? The Axial Age is, I would say, really kind of the second big shift that we see occurring in kind of the ideologies and philosophies, particularly in religious beliefs of the people that we've been studying so far this semester. Remember, the first real big shift occurred in a change or after a change in how people were sustaining themselves and how they began living in larger societies. Really, that transition through the process of agriculture, where kind of the traditional ideas of shamanism or animism, ancestor worship, began in certain locations to be replaced or augmented with sort of more universal deities, these sort of anthropomorphic nature gods that oftentimes had direct links to growing crops, to sustaining crops. How oftentimes the pantheons of these gods, for example, the Mesopotamian gods we talked about, the Egyptian gods, um, a lot of times they were set up to sort of mirror human societies, but a lot of times these deities had sort of the same frailties that humans had. They engaged in some of the same sort of behaviors that humans did. In a lot of ways, they were almost exactly the same as humans, except for they were really, really powerful, and oftentimes affected humans in a litany of ways. For example, making it rain, creating a flood, and so forth. With the Axial Age, starting around 1000 BCE or so, in various locations around the world, we really start to see this begin to change. And it seems like once people had been living in these large sedentary agricultural states for a sustained period of time, around the same time period, they began to have another sort of shift in mentality. And likely this came from living in increasingly large, increasingly diverse, and increasingly complex social structures, which were now being developed in these large kingdoms and empires built around sedentary agricultural life. Because it's really in all of these locations that you start seeing these new ideas popping up, and once again, all of them kind of popping up around the same time period, within about 1,000 years of each other. There's also evidence that these did not develop entirely on their own. That there's entirely possible that with trade that was occurring during this time period, that some of these ideas could have gotten transferred from one place to another, and you can start seeing some similarities from that regard as well. But how exactly are these ideas and philosophies of the Axial Age different from other religions that we have discussed so far this semester? Well, we talked about kind of the main functions and purpose of ancestor worship and animism was to, of course, kind of venerate one's ancestors, their heritage, where they came from, but also oftentimes to use those ancestors as either an intermediary to another kind of larger power, or to directly ask those ancestors for help or for aid. Similar to the anthropomorphic nature gods, they were in kind of the same sense being used to explain natural phenomenon. That they was oftentimes certain rituals or rites that a king or a priest would have to perform in order to get the favor, in order to prevent a flood, or in order to get a good rainfall or good crop. Increasingly with Axial Age societies, though, and Axial Age religions, people start asking different questions. The questions become much more focused on how an individual fits into the broader terms of spirituality and the broader terms of their society itself. There's a lot more focus on individual morality, for example, in a lot of these Axial Age religions. How should a person be behaving themselves, be functioning? In a lot of the earlier iterations of religions, in the kind of anthropomorphic nature god sense, there wasn't a real detailed emphasis on morality. I mean, a lot of times the deities and the gods acted just as immorally as humans did, and humans, when they acted immorally in their tales, weren't always necessarily rewarded or punished, accordingly. It seemed like there was not as clear of a link as you certainly see developing with a lot of the Axial Age religions, where individuals and people were expected to follow a distinct code of conduct and interact in their societies in a very particular way. The religions also become very much more individualistic, and the people are the primary agents. Whereas in former examples of religion, the head and most important kind of religious positions would be the king or a high priest, or some sort of intermediary. A lot of times, the Axial Age religion, it came down to the actions of the individual people. And in order to be rewarded or punished, you were essentially assessed on how well you lived or behaved during your lifetime, and how well you followed these rules of conduct or morality which were being created. And in a lot of ways, these are some of these new ideas that are propping up. People are thinking much more deeply and much more detailedly, is that a right word? I don't think so, but thinking much more detail, shall we say, about the sort of larger spiritual questions about morality and about humans should be functioning within their societies. And we'll see how that's going to be playing out in a lot of the religions coming up, whether it's this week with Confucianism and Taoism, whether it's next week with Buddhism or Jainism or Hinduism. But a good example that we've already discussed might be Zoroastrianism, which we talked about in the context of the Persian Empire. And Zoroastrianism could be considered kind of the first of these Axial Age religions. Remember, the main emphasis of Zoroastrianism was this idea of kind of a divine conflict between one really good god and one really evil god, and how human beings sort of played the role of fighting in this conflict, depending upon if they are behaving righteously and correctly, or if they are not, sort of choosing which side they are going to be on in this divine conflict. You can certainly see coming down towards if they are behaving in a way that is in alignment with the religion, they are supporting the good God in this conflict. If they're coming down the other side, they are supporting the other side. So everyone in their life is essentially making a choice on which side they want to be supporting. And you certainly see that same kind of idea of a divine conflict being replicated in other religions besides Zoroastrianism throughout time, and we'll be getting back to that concept in a few weeks as well. But for now, let's go on and take a look at a couple of examples that we talked about this week: Confucianism and Taoism. Alright, so in what ways did Taoism and Confucianism work together to form the basis of Chinese spiritual thought, and in what ways are these religions/philosophies examples of Axial Age ideas? So the primary tenets of Confucianism, we talked in their doctrine exercise about the idea of humanity, of humaneness, trying to treat everyone kind of with respect. And the biggest kind of context of Confucianism, right, was this idea of respect within a particular structure of relationships. Relationships form a key part of Confucianism, whether it is the behavior of a father towards his son, whether it is a wife towards her husband, whether it is a younger brother to an older brother, and all of these sort of family relationships of filial pieties, you might call it, and having the proper respect for people within your family. Once that's broadened over an entire society, then it makes up kind of a stable society. So, for example, a son was supposed to pretty much unquestioningly support his father and give his complete loyalty to the father. The father, for his end, was supposed to act benevolently in that role and not harm his son, not do things that were going to be bad for the family name or things that would hurt his son in the future. Same way between then a subject and his ruler, or the emperor. They were supposed to be completely loyal to the emperor, and in return the emperor was supposed to be benevolent then to the people. So you can kind of see these relationships on a local familial level being replicated throughout the rest of society. Remember, Confucian's main idea is that people were sort of inherently good, but they needed sort of the right examples to fulfill that roles. So getting back to the idea of the axial age, it very much fits into that context of how people are supposed to be behaving within society. How are they supposed to be treating one another? What's the right or the moral way to be behaving? Confucianism really kind of covers all of these contexts for China, and in a lot of ways forms the sort of political background and political sort of groundstones that China is going to build on for thousands of years coming after this time period, and how a lot of times its governing structure is going to be based around these ideas of Confucianism. Just as equally important on the spiritual side is Taoism, and the kind of concept of balance, the yin and yang symbol, for example, and how this is very much tied in with nature. How nature is supposed to constantly sort of be in balance, and how people are supposed to try to achieve some understanding of that balance, achieve that balance within their own life. But of course, there's very particular ways you have to be seeking that. You can't necessarily be trying to find it or trying to achieve it. It just has to really become sort of come natural through meditation, through observing and being in and within nature, through contemplation, and so forth. So just like Confucianism, you really see a lot of those same ideas of balance and harmony being supported with Taoism, even though it is in a much more spiritual way than in sort of a social kind of structure and political kind of structure with Confucianism. And hopefully one of the things you talked about and learned about in the document exercise from this week was how really, because neither one of these had sort of these universal truth claims that excluded the other, they ended up working very well together. And a lot of people throughout Chinese history practiced some degree of both of Confucianism and Taoism at the same time, with Confucianism sort of playing a larger role within organizing and structuring people's social and political life, whereas Taoism oftentimes functioned and supported more of people's religious life. But there was nothing of that supporting one would really preclude you from the others. People who were more interested and committed to Taoism might not take on as many of the kind of political roles in Confucianism, and might tend more towards being a little more aesthetic in lifestyle. People who were more Confucius, of course, would be more integrated within that. Perhaps they would be bureaucratic scholars or part of the bureaucracy, Confucian bureaucrats or something of that sort, but they still might, on the weekends, so to speak, go out into the countryside and meditate and try to, get their spirit more in line with the concepts of the Tao. So this is the way that they really kind of worked hand in hand, and how plenty of people found ways to incorporate both of them into their lifestyles. And it's really not surprising as time goes on and we see the introduction of new religious ideas into China, a lot of times through trade. For example, through the Silk Road, you see the introduction of Christianity, through the Nestorian Christians, of Islam, of Buddhism, how oftentimes these religions are welcomed into Chinese society, and that there's really never a real kind of conflict between Confucianism and whatever more sort of spiritual religious idea that people want to be focusing on. Eventually, Confucianism itself sort of transferred into something called Neo-Confucianism, which sort of adopts a lot of the ideology of Buddhism along with it, which gets much more spiritual as well. So, but it seems like even, and probably particularly because Confucianism was such a social and political philosophy, that there was always this room to be complemented with some other sort of more spiritual ideology to go along with it. Alright, so I had a lot of fun imaginings here of people who wanted to imagine that they were going to be soldiers in Shi Hongdi's army, and writing a description of their life and their observations of the Qin dynasty. A lot of people certainly pointed out a lot of kind of the repressive elements of Shi Hongdi's regime, how a lot of there was forced labor, very, very strict rules and laws, how Confucian and Confucian scholars were sort of attacked and demonized. Of course, it's entirely possible that some of this may have been overinflated by subsequent empires who wanted to kind of shine a bad light on the Qin dynasty. But you can certainly see the effects that this sort of very draconian ruling structure had on China, and the fact that even though it might not have been real fun to live there, they got really a lot of stuff done. The construction of the Great Wall, the construction of the Great Canal, construction of roads to link the empire together, and of course you have monumental construction projects. For example, the Terracotta Army that was constructed. So all of you were essentially pretending you were one of these little soldiers that had a replica made out of them and placed in this terracotta army. But very good inventiveness that a lot of people came up with here, sort of pointing out and highlighting the positives and negatives that came along with the Qin dynasty, because as much as it seemed like it would not have been an overly pleasant place to live, it certainly did found in a lot of ways the sort of bedrock of subsequent Chinese dynasties and empires. Alright, so number 4, create a list of the elements that made the Han Dynasty such a long-lasting and powerful empire. Make sure to explain why each element was important. A lot of people focused and mentioned the important impact that Confucianism was going to have within China, particularly through the education system, through these sort of exams that civil service elements that came along with Confucianism, how this sort of loyalty to the state and the sort of power structure that entailed became very, very central to kind of Chinese ideology. And really, in a state that was as large and diverse as China, it almost made a very large, complex bureaucratic system necessary. In order to keep things running, that no matter who was going to be at the top, no matter who the emperor was going to be, even if one dynasty falls and another comes into power, the fact that there's always going to be a very powerful, educated, dedicated sort of class of civil servants meant that a lot of continuity was going to be happening within China throughout time, and that's ultimately what we end up seeing happening. So certainly a huge contributing factor of Confucianism, of education, and of civil service would all work together to sort of form this bedrock that is going to last once more for thousands of years. The population was also mentioned, which is very good. China had very much kind of the largest population of any of the kingdoms or empires we have been talking about. And in the ancient world, really the only way to increase productivity was to increase population, and really one of the kind of biggest and clearest indicators of how well a civilization was doing was life expectancy and how they were able to grow their population. And China certainly showed that they were in the forefront of that, as they had usually higher life expectancy than other locations around the world, and that only helped grow their population, which is already large to begin with, even larger throughout time. Others pointed to kind of the strong leadership of the Han Dynasty through Han Wudi, through the diplomacy that he created with the various nomadic groups, with places as far away as Persia, as well as how he really backed and implemented that Confucian kind of ruling system, which was to become so important to China. The Silk Road and trade, I'd say, would be another huge aspect that a lot of people brought up. The fact that China became very much integrated into a world economy during this time period, and it became a very important way to get revenue, to get tax revenue, in order to get new exotic items and elements from across the world, and to give people who are producing a lot of these goods, producing the silk, producing the porcelain, and so forth, provide opportunity to a lot of people to earn wages or to make a living by engaging in the creation of these products for trade. So all this added together made China one of the wealthiest locations in the world at this time period, and it was only going to increase through time, primarily through this trade and exchange that they were always sort of on the cutting edge of. And finally, a lot of people mentioned the advancements in science and math that the Han Dynasty saw. For example, the abacus. Eventually, there's going to be a number of incredibly important technologies that come out of China, whether it's paper, whether it's gunpowder, whether it's the compass, whether it's the printing press. Incredibly revolutionary on a world stage, and they're all going to be developed in China. Certainly at this time period, they're kind of getting that idea of inventiveness and creation going, and you can certainly see that it's another factor that's going to make them such a long-standing and important empire in world history. Those are sort of the main highlights, and we'll move on from there. This is a little bit kind of more of a fun question. We've discussed many important and interesting historical figures this week. I would like you to choose one of the individuals we discussed, find some similarities to someone you know today. It's going to be someone you know in your personal life or someone famous, well known, who are familiar with. Explain why the historic figures reminds you of your modern choice. What aspects do they share in common, and what do you think would happen if the two ever met each other? And I really like the creativity that people use for this question too. They chose a number of historical figures we talked about, whether it was Han Wudi, whether it was Shi Hung Dai, whether it was Confucius, whether it was Lao Tzu. And they picked a lot of very interesting people in their current life. Some people picked family members, like their father or their uncle or their grandfather. Some people decided to choose famous people. They chose presidents, or they chose actors, or some other kind of public figure, or they chose another historical figure, for example, George Washington, or another historic figure in U.S. history. So a lot of great comparisons here that I thought you made, and allow you to kind of think creatively about some of this information. And I really liked how people focused in on sort of the personalities that these various leaders had, and how they thought they would either get along with their more modern equivalents, or how they thought there might be some tension and conflict with with those modern equivalents. A lot of people thought that they might have very strong ideas, so there could certainly be a conflict there. But a lot of people thought that there would be people who were incredibly smart and could have some really detailed, fun conversations that'd be really interesting to listen into. So no matter which way you took it, I thought you did a great job here. All right. From there, we are going to go ahead and move on to looking at our primary source exercise. Now, the primary source exercise for this week, quite a few people ended up losing a few points because I felt that you didn't dig quite as deep into the document as I would have liked, and didn't bring out as many of the examples as I might have liked for some of the questions. Sometimes you only put down one quote and then just a few sentences to explain that quote. And when we're talking about, 2, 3, 4 pages of information that I'm giving you here, I'm really expecting more than just one small quote and a short description of it to really try to start flushing out these ideas. So let's go through this document in a little bit more detail, and I'll show you some of the other areas and information that you could have picked out to use towards this document. And for future reference, just make sure that you're putting in a few various examples from different places within a document, and not just one example and running with it. Okay, so going on here to Confucius talking and discussing the idea of Gen, or humanness. And to begin with, he says quite simply that when asked about Gen, that it is love for all men, and when being asked about knowledge, that it is to know all men. And I think this is kind of a good place to start with Confucianism, that even though it can be seen as kind of a very structured and social and political kind of ideology, that there is sort of this idea of universal love within it as well, and that's kind of the default place that you should sort of be starting from. A few more specifics here, and this is another quote that a lot of people used within their answers here. Now the man of perfect humanness, wishing to be established himself, seeks also to establish others. Wishing to be enlarged himself, he seeks also to enlarge others. So it really kind of shows you once more that it's not just about the individual here, but he's talking about how the individual can improve the rest of society, can improve those around them. So it's not just about establishing yourself in these ideals, but it's about seeking to establish other people. Remember, a big part of Confucianism is trying to lead by example, and this is really what this idea of humanism is really kind of centered around leading through example. Wishing to enlarge himself, he seeks to enlarge others, right? So you're not only improving yourself, you're not only helping yourself, you're not only feeling compassion, but you're helping to instill those abilities and those qualities in other people. And this really goes on to this idea of reciprocity. When asked by one of his students, is there one word which may serve as a rule of practice for all of one's life? The master says, is not, the master here being Confucius, of course, is not reciprocity such a word? What you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others. This, of course, is going to be replicated in a number of different philosophies and faiths throughout time period. In the Christian tradition, this kind of same idea is known as the Golden Rule. It really gets to that center idea that if you want to be treating people humanely, you're going to want to be not treating them no differently than you would want to be treated yourself. Moving on down, he says, what his student asks, what do you say concerning the principle that injury should be recompensed with kindness? The master said, with that then will you recompense kindness, recompense injury with justice, and recompense kindness with kindness. So he's not saying that you have to just, certainly, in this kind of sense, turn the other cheek, so to speak, and just take whatever you're given, that you can sort of stand up, recompense injury with justice, not recompense injury of injury, but injury of justice, and then recompense kindness with kindness. Another focus that he comes on with here, you're going to see it throughout the rest of the document as well, is sort of this idea of moderation, of taking sort of the middle route, that these sort of sages or masters that he's talking about are not supposed to be perceived as kind of trying to be better than everyone else, that they're supposed to be living in the same quality of life and so forth. So he says, with coarse rice to eat, with water to drink, and my bended arm for a pillow, I still have joy in the midst of these things. Riches and honors acquired by inhumanity are to me as a floating cloud. So saying that he'd much rather have coarse rice to eat, with water to drink, sleeping on his arm instead of a pillow, and he'd be much happier than if he had all the riches and the luxuries if he acquired them inhumanely. Another kind of key central element there. And once more, you can sort of see how this is going to be extrapolating into being important in the larger context of Chinese society. Kind of saying this idea of greed for personal gain, just for personal gain, is not necessarily a good thing. The gain that you do make should be used to help or assist others. And if you gain something through devious means, that you should not be happy about that. Virtue is not left to stand alone. He who practices it will have neighbors. Once more, we're getting back to this idea of kind of the communal nature of Confucianism. Certainly, this is one of the kind of the key things you can really point to as part of how it is applying here to Axial Age thought. How so much of this is about sort of regulating one's place within society, and how you're supposed to be taking your views and benefiting society with that. Going down, talking about learning, he says those who are born with the possession of knowledge are the highest class of men, so certainly a lot of emphasis on knowledge. Those who learn so readily get possession of knowledge are next, so maybe people who aren't super bright to begin with, but they want to learn and they get better throughout time. He kind of puts them next. And he says those who are dull and stupid yet can pass the learning are another class, and by that he means people who are just kind of incapable of learning. Are the next class down, and the lowest form here, he says, as to those who are dull and stupid and yet do not learn, they are the lowest of people. So even he kind of making the point here that even if people aren't born the best or the smartest, or if they do not have the experience of being the best or the smartest, that they can still move up and improve themselves by gaining and possessing knowledge, and from that way can move up to these higher classes of people, and in that way you can really kind of see the importance that he's going to eventually be placing on an education, and it gets placed on education within China, particularly through this kind of scholar or bureaucratic class, as that's really one of the ways that they are able to improve themselves. And really throughout Chinese history, that becomes one of the few ways of kind of social mobility within within Chinese culture is being able to get the ability to take one of these exams, to pass that and get into the bureaucracy is one of the ways to kind of move up in the social classes of Chinese society. A scholar whose mind is set on truth and who is ashamed of bad clothes and bad food is not fit to be discoursed with. Once more, that gets back to the idea of kind of these scholars supposed to be or should be these sort of simple kind of individuals who are not overly concerned with worldly goods. Once more, you're going to see these same ideas replicated in different forms in the other ideologies we're going to be talking about later on. You're going to see this idea of kind of humility and of moderation and sort of the middle path being incredibly important to Buddhism, being important to Greek philosophy and Stoicism, and see it replicated in a number of the religions and philosophies we're going to be discussing. By extensively studying all learning and keeping himself under the restraint of the rules of propriety, one may thus likewise not err from what is right. And once more, I think this is absolutely kind of classic example here of axial age thought, right? The emphasis on studying and learning, but also keeping himself under the restraint of the rules of propriety. One may thus likewise not err from what is right. So what should one be doing in this context? Following the rules of propriety. Certainly this is kind of one of the things that makes Confucianism such a sort of political and social religion, is that it's really kind of focusing on people fulfilling their proper role within society, and that certainly is one of the aspects that makes it part of this sort of axial age religion as well. Finally, he says here in number 29, to have faults and not reform them, this indeed should be pronounced having faults. Once more, that idea of only those who have faults and do not try to improve on them, those who do not have knowledge and do not attempt to get knowledge, is where he is sort of placing a lot of his condemnation and his blame. And finally, he says, the wise are free from complexities, the virtuous from anxiety, and the bold from fear. So kind of giving his argument for why this sort of learning is very, very important to himself and to society as a whole. And once more, another reason why eventually education and an educated kind of class of people who are, in a lot of cases, kind of running all the nuts and bolts of Chinese society becomes so important to them. All right, let's move on to the Tao Te Ching and see what we can discover here. A lot of people, the vast majority of people, kind of use a lot of from this very early quote here in their answers. The Tao that can be known is not Tao. And of course, when we say Tao and Tao are pretty much interchangeable. Tao is sort of the old way of saying it, and Tao is now a little bit closer to the modern way of using the term. But just know that they are interchangeable. So the Tao that can be known is not Tao. The substance of the world is only a name for Tao. Tao is all that exists and may exist. And a lot of people did a good job interpreting this and trying to find other ways that fit in with Taoism and Taoist ideologies. Once more, I want you to push a little bit beyond that, though. I mean, when there's all these various pages and examples and lines from Taoism, simply putting down one phrase and basing everything on that is not doing an in-depth enough study of what I would like you to do. So make sure you're expanding your answers beyond just the first line in a document. Although this, of course, is a important line and it kind of sets the stage of really how extensive and expansive the idea of the Tao is, but also how it can be very difficult to come to know the Tao and how it's not a simple process. One of my students at one point in time, reading and trying to learn about Taoism, kind of complained to me and he said, I'm having a really difficult time learning about Taoism. It doesn't make any sense to me. He says it's one thing just contradicting another thing the whole time. It's just that's all it is. Just one thing contradicts. That just constantly contradicts itself. And I said, hey, it sounds like you're actually starting to get it, because essentially that's what it is, right? It's the idea of balance, of opposites, and of trying to sort of find one's place in respect to those opposites. And certainly you're going to see that as we go along here in some of these other quotes. For example, when beauty is recognized in the world, ugliness has been learned. When good is recognized in the world, evil has been learned. Kind of the idea that you can't have sort of good without evil, you can't have beauty without ugliness, that there's always going to be that there's always going to be that dichotomy to a certain degree, that there's always going to be different aspects within the world, and if you can't really sort of have one without the other. The sage controls without authority and teaches without words. Certainly, I think you can see a big difference between kind of a sentiment like that and Confucianism that we talked about earlier. How Confucianism placed so much emphasis on kind of that Confucius as the master and the lessons that he was sort of teaching his students and the rest of sort of the Chinese by default. With Taoism, it doesn't come down to kind of these sort of leaders or priests or sages who are supposed to be teaching people the way of the Tao. The Tao is so much more of a personal kind of spirituality that the only way you can really discover it and really learn it is to start sort of practicing it and discovering it for yourself. So that's why you don't see a lot of priests or sort of experts in Taoism as far as kind of trying to teach it to other people. It's much more about individuals coming to find it and find those answers for themselves. So what are some of the properties of the Tao? Tao is a depthless vessel. Its depths are hidden, ubiquitous, and eternal. I don't know where it came from. It came before nature. So once more, getting to that idea of just how large and fulfilling, the idea that it's kind of everything that is in the world or everything that could be in the world. Certainly incredibly kind of dense, heady thing to think about and get your mind around. But I think that's a very good quote that kind of shows that idea of just how expansive the concept of the Tao really is. Getting the idea of nature. Nature is not kind, it treats all things impartially. The sage is not kind and treats all people impartially. Kind of pointing out that nature doesn't really care. It's going to have the same rules for everyone and everything. Everything kind of fits within it. And he says that kind of the sage should be the same way. He should be very impartial. They should not treat one person or one individual better than another. Try to treat all things equally, just as they are seen within nature. This next section on hubris, I think, really starts to point out that idea once again of the opposites within Taoism, and how striving in trying to understand the Tao is not the way to do it. It has to come much more naturally than that. So, for example, they say, stretch a bow to its limits and it is soon broken. Temper a blade to its sharpest and it's soon blunted. Amass the greatest treasure and it is soon stolen. Claim credit and honor and soon you will fall. Retire once your purpose is achieved. This is the way of nature. So kind of the more you try for something, the more you strive for something, the more it kind of slips through your fingers. Whereas if you kind of keep a humble purpose and are happy once that is achieved, that is much more in line with the way of nature. So don't try to stretch the bow to its absolute limit. Don't try to temper your blade so it's the sharpest blade ever. Don't try to amass the most treasure and the most fortune. Don't try to claim the most credit and the most honor. Instead, once more, just like we saw with Confucianism, try to be much more moderate, much more humble than that. Do what you were supposed to do in your place, and not more than that. And once more, you're going to see that, like I said, replicated in a number of the ideologies and philosophies that we're going to be talking about throughout the class. Once more, the kind of opposites is seen here in this concept on distraction. Too much color blinds the eye, too much tone deafens the ear, too much taste dulls the palate, too much play maddens the mind, too much desire tears the heart. And This idea that sort of overindulgence actually leads to unhappiness is another thing that you're seeing presented here with Taoism, but you're going to be seeing it in Confucianism. You're going to be seeing it next week with Tao, or next week with Buddhism and Jainism. You're going to be seeing it the next week with Epicureanism. And Stoicism, how this idea of overindulgence doesn't bring pleasure, and a lot of times is the reason for discomfort, or where a lot of people's problems come from. So you can certainly see those elements here with Taoism as well. All right. So I think that wraps up kind of our review here of the documents. A lot of you did a very good job then of describing how these two kind of ideas fit together to form the bedrock of Chinese philosophy moving forward, whether it is sort of acknowledging nature and the opposites, as well as fulfilling one's kind of familiar role with Confucianism while trying to still achieve this idea of humaneness, and to pass that on to the people and community around you, the importance of knowledge, the importance of learning, and really through both of them, the importance of not overindulging, the importance of prizing kind of simplicity and only doing one's, or staying within kind of one's space, so to speak. All right, I hope this was beneficial to all of you. Of course, any questions, please let me know, and I'll be back for our next review video.